Recapped. Today I'm going to show you a 2016 sci-fi romance drama movie called Passengers. Watch out and take care. The interstellar spaceship Avalon can be seen traveling through space, headed to a colonized world called Homestead 2. All of its quarters are empty. The vessel is on autopilot. The 258 crew members, as well as the 5,000 passengers, are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship passes through an asteroid belt, weakening its shields. Power is diverted to the main shield, but the ship is on a collision course with a giant asteroid. Suddenly, the asteroid collides with the ship, causing various malfunctions. The ship begins self-reparations, but one of the hibernation pods activates. His pod opens, and an automated system helps with his awakening, telling him that he's spent 120 years in suspended animation and that the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. He's told that he will be able to spend that time enjoying the luxurious aspects of the ship. Jim receives instructions about his ID band, his cabin, and the primary activities he's to take part in before the arrival on the planet. Excited and nervous to meet the people on the ship, he gets ready, leaves his cabin, and walks into an automated class meant for an entire learning group. Jim looks a little anxious as the hologram explains the situation on Earth, calling it overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. It tells him to hold his questions to the end of the lesson. He realizes that the hologram can't answer him and goes to search for other people. He gets to the main concourse of the ship. No one is there either, but an automated informational desk offers to help. Jim asks to talk to a real person, and it sends him off to talk to a steward. But when he finds that no one is there too, he asks to speak to the captain. When he gets to the bridge, even though he doesn't have access to go inside, he can see that none of the main crew is awake either. Jim eventually goes to the observatory, where he finds out that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. He realizes that he woke up too soon, so he rushes back to the concourse and sends a message back to Earth asking what he should do. The communication system informs him that the overpriced call to Earth would take approximately 55 years to get an answer back. Jim is devastated. He walks around and finds the ship's bar, where he sees another person. As he's talking to the bartender, something seems strange about him. When he goes to get him a drink, Jim realizes that he's an android. It's called Arthur. Jim wants to find out more information from him, but he can't even explain to the android how it's possible for him to be there ahead of time. Jim wakes up in his cabin the next day and goes to the cantina, where he quickly realizes that most of the things on the menu are reserved for gold-class passengers only. He gets his plain coffee and tries to figure out how to fix his hibernation chamber. After he gets all the tools, he manages to get it operating. Next, he decides to use the tools he found to get into the crew's hibernation chambers. That doesn't work either. Small malfunctions happen around the ship. Jim keeps returning to the bar to drink, but mostly to talk to Arthur. The android gives him some advice that convinces him to break into one of the gold-class rooms and try to have some fun on the ship. Jim tries all the restaurants, the games, and the entertainment system. But as time passes, he becomes even more miserable to be there alone. One day, he gets drunk and wanders around the hibernation pods when he stumbles into an airlock with spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim gets into a suit and goes to the airlock, pushes a lever, and then the button to release the airlock door. Once outside the ship, he's mesmerized by the view. Jim releases the magnets on his boots and floats in space, feeling devastated. He comes back inside, takes off the suit, but goes back to the airlock without it on. He pulls the lever, ready to end it all, but changes his mind at the last moment, runs back inside, and slips on a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly drawn to a woman in one of the pods named Aurora. He searches for her files in the directory and listens to her passenger interview, becoming enamored with her. Later, he's seen sitting next to her pod, still listening to her interviews. Back in the bar, he's reading some of her work. He becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation, going to another planet for a better life, waking up early and not getting there, and finding his perfect woman only for her to be out of reach. Jim keeps thinking about her and starts getting the idea to wake her up too. He talks it over with the android, but he doesn't understand the conundrum. If he wakes her up for his own benefit, he'd be stranding her there with him to die on the ship. Jim decides against it at first, but as time goes by, he can't let it go. Until one day, he changes his mind. He goes to her pod and manages to activate it. As she's waking up and going through the same process as he did, he hides and goes back to his room. A little bit later, he goes to the main concourse, hoping to find her. And there she is, just as confused as he was a year ago. Jim tells her they're the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. Then he tells her that Aurora freaks out and wants to get back into her pod. When they get to it, Jim explains that there is no special equipment on the ship that can help them get back into hibernation, effectively telling her that they're stranded. They go back to the concourse, and he tells her that she should rest since she just came out of hibernation. She feels sorry for him, having to spend more than a year alone on the ship. Jim goes back to the bar, feeling regretful about what he did. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one that woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up. She goes back to the concourse and asks the automated info desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there, and they go to get breakfast. In the cantina, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him one of the gold class menus. They talk about the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora isn't ready to give up. She searches through the infirmary, then goes through research documents, eventually ending up at the crew's hibernation quarters trying to break the doors open. Jim notices more malfunctions throughout the ship. Sometime later, Aurora laments about her life on the Avalon. She writes, jogs around the ship, and swims in the pool, becoming more and more aware of her situation. She goes to the cantina to interview Jim, thinking that his story might be interesting. She asks why he immigrated to the colony. Jim answers with slogans from the company first, but then further explains that he hopes later they end up in the observatory and Aurora finally shares her reason to be there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her idea was to go to Homestead to live there for a year and come back to Earth to become the first journalist that has ever done that, writing the greatest story that ever was. Aurora slowly gives up on finding a way to fix their current predicament, and Jim figures out a way to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Lastly, he takes her to the bar to meet Arthur. She relaxes for a bit until she remembers their situation. Jim is left alone with the next moment he's seen tinkering with something. And in the other, Aurora walks into the observatory to find a miniature of the Chrysler building he made for her. Sometime later, they go on a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock and they get into the spacesuits. They go out for a spacewalk together. Jim finally has someone to share that magnificent experience with. Jim switches off the magnets on their boots and they float together in space. They come back inside and immediately kiss, retreat to his cabin, and sleep together. Soon after, they start living like a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, and sleep together. Jim explores the ship further. One day, the ship passes by a red giant, and they go to the observatory to see it. It's Aurora's birthday, so later that night, they celebrate it in one of the many restaurants on the ship and then the bar. Jim goes to the washroom and prepares the ring he made for Aurora, while she stays in the bar chatting with Arthur. Unaware that Jim didn't want him to, Arthur tells Aurora that Jim woke her up. When Jim returns, he finds her devastated. She calls him a murderer and goes back to her cabin. Jim keeps asking for her forgiveness, but Aurora keeps avoiding him. As more malfunctions occur throughout the ship, she tries to find a way to survive without talking to him. She runs through the ship every day, beating her hands bloody on the door of the crew's hibernation quarters. Jim keeps noticing the ship malfunctioning and becomes preoccupied with fixing things. That night, Aurora's cabin runs out of air while she's sleeping. She rushes to the concourse, but it's empty. Jim arrives in time to help her. She collapses in his arms and then pushes him away. The next morning, Gus Mancuso, the chief deck officer, wakes up in his pod. He immediately realizes that something's wrong with the ship, takes his ID band, and heads to the concourse, where he finds Jim and Aurora. Gus assigns them to collect data manually because the automated system keeps malfunctioning. As they reach the reactor, Jim realizes that Gus's hibernation pod failed because of an error. Gus opens the door for them, and Jim realizes that something happened 2 years ago when the ship went through the asteroid field, causing a major system failure. Gus tells them that if they don't find and fix the issue soon, they could lose the ship. As Gus's health deteriorates, Jim and Aurora find that the main problem lies with the reactor control computer. They find a way to replace the part, but the venting process fails, so Jim realizes that he must manually open the vent door from the outside to cool the reactor. He goes out in a spacesuit and holds the door open, but gets pushed away by the fumes. Aurora manages to get him back inside and use the medical pod to revive him. Aurora forgives Jim and they continue their life together on the ship. Jim proposes to Aurora and they live out their lives happily. 88 years later, the crew wakes up to find the ship transformed into a Aurora leaves a message recounting their story, making sure it's remembered. Thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe and like